Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
There are certain moments in life where you feel like if you just get this one thing right, you might finally be seen differently, respected differently, maybe even loved differently, and for me, hosting Thanksgiving for the first time was exactly that kind of moment. I had spent years watching from the sidelines as my mother effortlessly orchestrated elaborate family gatherings, her silverware always polished to a mirror shine, her turkey cooked to magazine perfection, and her house smelling like cinnamon and unattainable standards. Every Thanksgiving, I stood there, a side character in someone else's tradition, my only contribution being a bottle of wine, or, if I was feeling bold, a store-bought pie that was always left unopened next to her handcrafted desserts. So when my mother casually mentioned back in September that it might be nice if someone younger took over for once, my heart practically leapt out of my chest with hope and panic at the same time. I volunteered before I could think it through, the words flying out of my mouth with the desperation of a kid who had never been picked first for anything. She blinked at me like she was trying to decide if I was joking, and when she gave a tight smile and said, "If you think you can handle it, dear," I knew this was my shot, my one real chance to finally be part of the inner circle of respect. From the moment I sent out the email invitations to my sprawling, drama-prone family, I knew it was a risk. I crafted it carefully, trying to sound casual yet responsible, slipping in one little line about costs. Given the size of our gathering this year, we'll be splitting expenses. Hope everyone's okay with that. I buried it between details about parking and turkey preferences, hoping no one would pay too much attention, but that it would still be there, in black and white, when I needed it. Because the truth was, I wasn't going to cook this thing myself. No way in hell. I had spent enough holidays watching my mother slowly transform from Martha Stewart to a simmering rage monster by the end of the night. I wasn't about to kill myself over a turkey just to have Aunt Linda criticize the stuffing or Cousin Becky complain that the cranberry sauce wasn't zesty enough. So, 3 weeks before the big day, I quietly made arrangements with a local catering company, one with rave reviews, and a price tag that made my stomach twist when I signed the contract. $2,000 for the full spread, appetizers, entrees, sides, desserts, the whole 9 yards. Worth it, I told myself. Worth every penny for my sanity and maybe, finally, my acceptance. As Thanksgiving week crept closer, my anxiety ratcheted up higher with every passing day. I triple-checked the rental chairs. I ironed tablecloths until my arms hurt. I even spent an entire evening crafting homemade centerpieces out of miniature pumpkins and fake autumn leaves because Becky had once said my decorating style was very, functional. I was determined to prove to every last one of them that I could not just host Thanksgiving, but host it better than any of them ever had. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke up before dawn, my nerves buzzing so loudly it felt like my whole body was plugged into a faulty outlet. The catering truck arrived exactly at 9, and by noon my house smelled like a gourmet dream: roasted turkey with sage, buttery mashed potatoes, rich, savory stuffing, pies cooling on the counter like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. I slipped on my best sweater, touched up my makeup 3 times, and tried not to jump every time a car pulled into the driveway. The first guests trickled in around 1. Uncle Roy, booming and red-faced from the cold, clapped me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over and barked, "Well, look at you, hosting the big show." I laughed too loudly, nerves snapping under my skin like dry twigs. Aunt Linda floated past me without so much as a hello, her sharp eyes scanning the living room like she was already tallying up everything I had done wrong. Then came Cousin Becky, all sleek blonde hair and fake enthusiasm, sweeping in with her husband and 2 shrieking toddlers. She kissed the air near my cheek, gave me that slow, pitying once-over she had perfected in high school, and leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume. "Relax," she whispered, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "No one takes your little dinner seriously." I smiled so wide my face hurt, the kind of smile you paste on when you're trapped in a nightmare and trying desperately not to scream. I turned away before she could see the way my hands were shaking, before she could see the storm building behind my eyes. Because what Becky and the rest of them didn't know yet was that today, I wasn't just hosting Thanksgiving. I was setting the table for something they would never see coming. There is a very particular kind of rage that comes from being insulted so quietly, so politely, that if you react, you look like the crazy one, and as I moved around my living room, balancing trays of carefully catered hors d'oeuvres and dodging small, sticky-fingered children, I felt that rage bubbling just under my carefully painted-on smile. Aunt Linda, who had once been asked to leave a bed and breakfast for berating the owner about the inferior thread count of the sheets, immediately planted herself in the middle of the dining room and began offering loud, performative praise that was just sharp enough to leave bruises. "Oh, how adorable," she cooed, looking directly at the table settings I had spent hours arranging the night before. "It's just like one of those casual little setups you see at roadside diners. So homey." Her voice was pitched high and bright, but her eyes gleamed like a butcher's knife. I nodded stiffly, feeling the heat crawl up the back of my neck, and murmured something like "glad you like it," while mentally counting down the seconds until I could shove a drink into her hand and move her somewhere, anywhere, away from the rest of my hard work. Meanwhile, the kids, a roving gang of my cousin's progeny, hopped up on sugary snacks and anarchy, were tearing through my living room like tiny tornadoes. I winced as I watched one of them knock over a vase, catching it just in time before it shattered against the hardwood floor. Becky, of course, made a show of shrugging, laughing that awful breathy laugh of hers, and saying, "Boys will be boys," loud enough for everyone to hear. I thought about telling her that one day those boys would probably set fire to someone's garage, but instead I pressed my smile harder into my face and passed out more wine. By the time the food was finally laid out, gleaming golden turkey, towering bowls of mashed potatoes, stuffing that smelled like it had been kissed by angels, I was practically vibrating with suppressed emotion. I watched Uncle Roy stab a fork into the stuffing, shovel a massive bite into his mouth, chew thoughtfully for a few seconds, and then declare, "Tastes kinda store-bought, doesn't it?" in a tone that suggested he was just helping me out by pointing out my failures before anyone else could. Becky chimed in a moment later, lifting her glass and grinning slyly. "Yeah, it has that, professionally bland taste." Several heads around the table nodded, and a few forced laughs trickled out like leaky faucets. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, but still, I smiled. I told myself that I had known this was going to happen, that this was just par for the course, that they could mock and belittle all they wanted because today, for once, I was not going to be the one left holding the emotional bag at the end of the night. No, today I had a plan. Now, somewhere around here, I should mention that I had spent nearly $3,000 on the catering. Well, maybe it was closer to $1,500, to be honest. I have never been good at math, especially when I am stressed and my mind feels like it is being chewed apart by a pack of wild dogs. Either way, it was a hell of a lot of money, more than I could really afford, but it felt necessary, like buying my way into a version of family acceptance that maybe, just maybe, would finally stick. As the afternoon wore on and the wine flowed more freely, the commentary around the table got looser and meaner. Uncle Roy started telling long, meandering stories about how in his day people knew how to cook from scratch, with real ingredients and real skill, not like today's lazy, microwave generation frauds. Becky interrupted at one point to make a crack about how some people thought hosting just meant dialing a number and writing a check. I laughed along because what else could I do, because standing up and flipping the table over felt a little too much like giving them exactly what they wanted. The kids were still running wild. Someone had already spilled cranberry sauce all over my carefully pressed linen runner, and Aunt Linda was holding court about how in her house, Thanksgiving had standards. I moved through it all in a daze, offering refills, clearing plates, feeling less like a hostess and more like a waitress in a health-themed diner where the customers tipped in judgment. Eventually, I could not take another second of it without cracking, so I slipped away under the pretense of checking on the pies, which were cooling in the kitchen. I walked past the kitchen island, past the counters piled with dirty dishes and half-eaten appetizers, and straight to the little secretary desk tucked against the far wall. From the drawer, I pulled out a thick manila envelope, one I had prepared 2 nights ago when I realized exactly how this night was going to go. Inside were 2 things: a copy of the catering invoice, detailing every last dollar of that beautiful, professionally made meal, and a printed RSVP list where each smug little name had been carefully highlighted under the words agreed to split costs. I stood there for a moment, envelope in hand, heart hammering in my ears, and thought about the exact moment I would make my move. Not yet. No, not yet. Let them gorge themselves a little more. Let them get comfortable. Let them believe, for 1 more hour, that they had gotten away with it again. Because tonight, for the first time, I was not playing by their rules. Tonight, I had written a whole new game, and they did not even know they had already lost. Dinner had slipped into that bloated, lazy stretch where the conversation gets slower, the laughter gets louder, and the wine gets poured a little too generously by people who stopped keeping track somewhere around their 3rd glass. Plates were piled high with 2nd and 3rd helpings, the good linens were stained with gravy and red wine, and the kids had finally crashed into quiet, sticky piles on the couch, half asleep and sugar-drunk. It was, by all appearances, the peak of a successful Thanksgiving meal, and standing at the head of the table, watching the carnage with a smile that probably looked a little too tight, I realized it was finally time. I tapped my glass gently with the back of a spoon, the soft chiming sound cutting through the chatter like a polite little knife. Heads turned toward me, some smiling indulgently, others looking mildly irritated at being pulled away from their food. I felt a curious sort of calm settle over me, the same kind of calm I imagined a magician feels just before the big reveal, when the audience still thinks they know what's happening. I just wanted to say, I began, my voice bright and steady in a way that surprised even me, how incredibly grateful I am to have all of you here today. Hosting Thanksgiving has always been a dream of mine, and seeing everyone together under my roof, well, it just fills my heart in ways I can hardly describe. There were a few scattered murmurs of agreement, some half-hearted clapping, a smirk from Becky that she did not bother to hide. I let it all wash over me and continued, smoothing my hand down the front of my sweater as though brushing away invisible dust. I know we all have busy lives, I said, pitching my voice just a little softer, making them lean in, and it's not always easy to carve out time for family. So today, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for supporting this little gathering. A few more nods, a few glasses lifted in lazy toasts. They were relaxed, sated, just drunk enough to be slow on the uptake. Perfect. And speaking of support, I added, keeping my tone light and breezy, I have a little something for all of you. Just a small reminder of our teamwork. With that, I reached beneath the table, where I had tucked the thick envelope earlier, and pulled out a neat stack of crisp white envelopes, each one addressed by hand. I moved down the table, placing one gently under each plate, smiling sweetly into the confused, slightly apprehensive faces turned up toward me. They did not open them right away. For a moment, they just stared, as though suspecting some kind of joke, but not quite willing to play along until they were sure. It was Becky who moved first, flipping her envelope over, sliding out the sheet of paper inside with a flick of her manicured nails. Her smile froze in place as she scanned the contents, her eyes darting rapidly from line to line. The ripple effect was immediate. Around the table, envelopes were opened, papers unfolded, and the quiet hum of confusion grew into a low, buzzing murmur. Then Uncle Roy, who had gone beet red from either wine or fury, maybe both, slammed his fist on the table so hard that the silverware jumped. "Wait," he bellowed, waving the paper in the air like a battle flag. "You expect us to pay for this?" The room went dead silent, all eyes snapping to me. I smiled, the kind of smile you practice in the mirror when you need to look both innocent and just dangerous enough to make people think twice about pushing you. Of course, I said, tilting my head slightly. I mean, we all agreed to share the costs, remember? It was in the invitation. I reached back into the envelope and withdrew my second weapon, a neatly printed RSVP list, each family member's name highlighted under the words agreed to split costs, the emailed consent frozen forever in time. I handed it to Uncle Roy with exaggerated care, making sure the highlights were impossible to miss. He snatched it from my hand and squinted at it, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, like a man trying to argue with gravity. Around the table, there was a sudden flurry of movement as wallets were yanked from purses and pockets, nervous laughter bubbling up here and there as people tried to figure out how serious I was. I mean, come on, Becky said, trying for a tone of mock outrage, but not quite pulling it off. You can't be serious. It's Thanksgiving. You don't charge people for Thanksgiving. I shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. I guess next time you'll read the fine print, I said, my voice sweet enough to rot teeth. Aunt Linda pressed her lips into a thin line, rifling through her designer wallet with a series of sharp, angry movements. Becky and her husband bickered in hushed tones over whether they had enough cash or if they needed to Venmo me. Cousins who had not even said hello properly were now trying to remember how many servings of turkey they had eaten and whether it was worth fighting over $50. Uncle Roy, meanwhile, was turning a deeper shade of purple by the second. He slammed his wallet down on the table, sending a spray of crumbs flying, and barked, "This is bullshit. I'm not paying a goddamn dime." The room froze again, the tension so thick you could have sliced it with the very butter knives that were now lying abandoned next to half-eaten plates of pie. I met his furious gaze without flinching, letting the silence stretch between us like a tightrope, daring him to step off. Inside, my heart was hammering so loudly I was sure they could all hear it, but outside, I was all calm detachment, the perfect picture of someone who had simply followed the rules they themselves had agreed to. I could feel it in the air the split second before everything really, truly broke apart, and I smiled again, slow and deliberate, as I sat back down at the head of the table, folding my napkin carefully into my lap like a queen surveying a kingdom about to descend into civil war. The first shouts broke through the stunned silence like stones hurled through a stained glass window, and in an instant, the entire fragile illusion of family warmth shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces scattered across my carefully laid table. Uncle Roy was the loudest, of course, his voice booming so loud it seemed to shake the walls, but it was Cousin Becky who struck the first real blow, standing up so fast her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor, her wine sloshing dangerously over the rim of her glass, as she pointed one perfectly manicured finger directly at me. "This is manipulation," she shouted, her voice rising in pitch with each word. "This whole thing was a setup from the beginning, wasn't it? You just wanted to humiliate us." Around her, others were nodding in a grim chorus, some angrily flipping through their copies of the bill as if somehow, someway, they might find a loophole that would erase the damning numbers printed in black and white. I could see it happening, the tide turning swiftly against me, the narrative slipping through my fingers like sand no matter how tightly I tried to hold on. "You think you're better than us now," Becky spat, her face flushing with that ugly, familiar shade of entitlement she had worn like armor since we were kids, "because you can throw some money around and host a stupid little dinner?" For a moment, I opened my mouth to respond, to explain that it was never about the money, that it had never even really been about the food, but the words stuck in my throat like dry bread because deep down, I knew they would not listen. They had never listened before, not when we were teenagers and I had begged them to stop teasing me in front of the whole school. Not when I had cried on my 16th birthday after they gifted me a sweater 2 sizes too small with a tag that read, "Just a little motivation." I blinked hard against the sudden sting in my eyes, the sharp burn of old wounds ripping open under the weight of new ones, and for a moment, just one terrible moment, I felt the old familiar urge to apologize, to back down. to smooth everything over even though I was not the one who had made this mess. I gripped the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles turned white, feeling the cool linen bite into my skin, grounding me, reminding me that this time I had not come to this battle unarmed. "You all agreed," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady considering the storm inside me. "You all said yes. Maybe you did not read the whole invitation. Maybe you thought you could just ignore it like you always do. But you agreed." Aunt Linda scoffed loudly, tossing her hair back in a dramatic gesture that made her look even more ridiculous than usual, and muttered something under her breath about traps and tacky behavior, and that was when I felt the last fragile thread of my patience snap. I straightened up slowly, feeling the brittle shell of vulnerability crack and fall away, leaving only something hard and unyielding behind. I scanned their faces, these people who had spent years sharpening their tongues on my insecurities, who had cheered each other's cruelty and called it family tradition, and I realized I did not care anymore whether they liked me, whether they approved of me, whether they thought I was good enough to sit at their damn table. "You always told me family meant pitching in," I said, my voice low and cold enough to silence even Uncle Roy for a moment. "You just never expected you'd have to do it for someone like me." There it was, naked and ugly and undeniable, and judging by the way Becky's mouth snapped shut and Uncle Roy's fists clenched on the tablecloth, they knew it too. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved, the air thick with the kind of tension that usually ends in broken dishes or broken hearts, and then Uncle Roy shoved back from the table with enough force to rattle the glasses, his chair clattering to the floor behind him. He snatched up his jacket from the back of his chair and stomped toward the door, muttering curses under his breath loud enough for even the kids to hear. "This is bullshit," he barked as he wrenched the front door open with a bang, so loud it made the plates jump again, "and you can keep your damn invoice." The door slammed behind him with a sound that echoed through the house like the final note of a ruined song, and for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, the only sound the soft clinking of silverware settling back into place. It was only when I sat down again, trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash, that I noticed Uncle Roy's jacket lying abandoned on the chair, half hanging to the floor where he had dropped it in his fury. And sticking conspicuously out of one of the pockets, plain as day, was a thick wad of cash, the corner of a $100 bill peeking out like a taunt or an invitation. I stared at it for a long, long moment, my mind spinning faster than I could catch, weighing possibilities against consequences, petty satisfaction against lingering guilt. I could already imagine the arguments that would come if I touched it, the accusations, the self-righteous fury, but then again, had they not already accused me of worse? Had they not already written the story in which I was the villain, the manipulator, the bad seed? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and watched as the family picked awkwardly at their plates, pretending not to notice the thick tension still hanging in the air. No one reached for the jacket. No one looked at me. No one apologized. And, for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I did not owe them a damn thing either. The air in the house shifted after Uncle Roy slammed the door, not in a dramatic, movie scene kind of way, but in a slow, creeping sense that something irreversible had happened, and no one quite knew how to move forward through the wreckage. One by one, the others started gathering their things, still muttering under their breath, pulling out crumpled bills and tossing them onto the table with tight mouths and eyes that would not quite meet mine. Becky made a big show of counting out $60 in singles, slapping them down onto the table so hard that a few floated to the floor, and her husband followed with a mumbled apology that sounded more like an insult. Aunt Linda, who had so far avoided direct confrontation by busying herself with straightening the hem of her jacket and loudly sighing at regular intervals, finally approached the table, placed 2 crisp $20 bills down with the tips of her fingers like she was leaving a tip at a truck stop, and muttered, "Consider it a donation," before sweeping out the door in a cloud of perfume and resentment. The cousins followed next, their faces awkward and stiff, dropping 20s and 10s and a few crumpled 5s onto the pile like guilty kids handing over stolen candy. No one asked for change. No one said thank you. No one, not even Becky, could muster up another insult, which somehow stung worse than if they had screamed the house down. The front door opened and closed, each departure a punctuation mark on the death sentence of the evening I had spent weeks building in my mind. Finally, when the last car engine had rumbled away down the street and the sounds of fake laughter and real bitterness had faded into the night, I stood alone in my living room, the soft buzz of the overhead light filling the silence like a mosquito trapped in a jar. Plates and glasses were abandoned wherever they had been dropped, smears of cranberry sauce staining the white linen like blood, chairs knocked askew in chaotic little clusters. The house looking less like the scene of a celebration and more like a battlefield after the armies had fled. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, the food congealing on platters, the crumpled napkins thrown carelessly onto the floor, and felt a hollow ache open wide in my chest. This had not been the victory I had imagined, the gleaming, movie-perfect scene where they finally saw me, finally respected me, finally treated me like I mattered. Instead, all I was left with was a room full of wreckage, a half-hearted pile of cash on the table, and a growing, gnawing question in the back of my mind that I was too scared to answer. Was it worth it? I wandered back to the dining room, my feet dragging, my hand brushing the back of each empty chair like I was saying goodbye to something I couldn't quite name. The envelope still lay on the table where I had left it, the RSVP list sitting on top, now dotted with wine stains and greasy fingerprints, the highlighted names smudged, but still visible, as damning as ever. And there, on the chair Uncle Roy had abandoned in his rage, was his jacket, crumpled and forlorn, one sleeve hanging limply toward the floor. The cash was still there, stuffed haphazardly into the pocket, a thick, vulgar wedge of green that seemed to glow in the dim light. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above the fabric, my mind racing with possibilities. If I took it, I could easily justify it. After all, he had agreed to pay, and he had stormed out without doing so. It would not even cover the full cost of the catering, but it would be something, some small recompense for the hours of preparation, the 1,000 little humiliations absorbed with a smile, the private hope that maybe this year would finally be different. But still, I hesitated, because taking it would mean stepping fully into the role they had already assigned me, the villain of the story, the petty, spiteful relative they would whisper about for years to come at gatherings I probably would not even be invited to anymore. And yet, did it really matter? Had they not already decided who I was long before today? Had anything I ever done been enough to earn more than their scorn masked as teasing, their judgment hidden under thin smiles? I sat down heavily at the table, the jacket and the money still untouched beside me, and reached for a plate of pumpkin pie that no one had bothered to eat. The slice wobbled a little as I dragged it closer, the whipped cream melting into a sad puddle, the crust crumbling apart at the edges, like even it could not hold itself together anymore. I picked up a fork, poked at the pie half-heartedly, and stared out the window into the dark, empty street. Somewhere down the block, someone had strung Christmas lights already, little pinpricks of red and green blinking stupidly against the night, oblivious to the mess of human emotions spilling out from my house like smoke from a fire too long left untended. Maybe, I thought, maybe this was what standing up for yourself looked like. Maybe it was not clean or triumphant or celebrated. Maybe it was ugly and lonely and left you sitting at a table full of cold food and cold feelings, wondering if the price of dignity was always paid in isolation. I stabbed the pie with my fork, watching it collapse under the pressure, and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle over me like a too heavy blanket. Funny thing about family, I thought, staring at the money and the mess and the ruins of my big Thanksgiving debut, they say blood is thicker than water. But sometimes, it's just a hell of a lot harder to wash off.